Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Center. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen. He's professor of developmental psychopathology at the University of Cambridge. He is also director of the university's Autism Research Centre. He has made major contributions to the fields of typical cognitive sex differences, autism prevalence and screening, autism genetics, autism neuroimaging, autism and technical ability, and synesthesia. He is the author of books like Mind Blindness, The Science of Evil, and more recently, The Pattern Seeker. So, Dr. Baron-Cohen, welcome to the show. It's an honor to everyone.
Thank you, Ricardo, for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So we're going to focus our conversation today on autism, and I hope we also get enough time to, we have enough time to get into sex differences in cognition. So tell us first, what is autism then? I mean, and because later on, perhaps we'll get also into the idea of neurodiversity. Yeah. Do you think about it as really a disorder or just part of the normal variation in terms of human cognition?
Right. So first of all, I don't use the word disorder in relation to autism. Mm-hmm. And that's really because I think the word disorder is wholly negative and therefore could be stigmatizing.
Right.
So I prefer the words difference, which relates to the concept of neurodiversity. We'll talk about that. But also, I see autism as involving disability. And so it's not a single, you can't characterize it in a single way. I think it's both difference and disability. So for me, the disability, let's start with that part. That autism involves difficulties with social interaction, social relationships, and communication, and also difficulties with adjusting to unexpected change. So these are individuals who like predictability. They need structure and routine and rules in order to feel that they can cope, and they can feel overwhelmed if they're in a situation which is unpredictable. And the social world is often like that. But autism is also a difference because these are individuals who process information very differently. They tend to focus on detail. So they have very good attention to detail, often excellent memory for detail. And they like to go into a single topic in great depth, which clinicians sometimes call obsessions, but actually it just means that they like depth rather than breadth. So these are differences, and I don't think they cause any disability. In fact, sometimes they result in strengths or even talents. And then the last thing to mention is that autistic people can have other conditions. So you can have autism plus learning disability, where your general intelligence is below the average range. You can have autism and language disability, for example, having very little expressive language. But these are kind of separate to autism. And so what we've been doing in our research is to try to separate what is autism and what are the other conditions that sometimes co-occur with autism.
In my initial question, I used the word disorder because in a clinical context, at least as far as I'm aware, that's the way people refer to autism and also other conditions.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, and that is why I wanted also to ask you about the idea of neurodiversity, because this is sort of a new perspective in how we should look at these conditions, or at least the variability we have when it comes to human cognition, correct?
Yes, exactly. So you're absolutely right that internationally, people describe autism as a disorder. And the language comes from the American Psychiatric Association, the body that publishes DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Almost all of the diagnoses in DSM are described as disorders. And my colleagues in America explained to me that if you don't call it a disorder, then people don't get health insurance for support or intervention. So the word disorder in that context, in that country, is very important as a way of unlocking resources, and support. But as I mentioned earlier, I don't really like the word disorder because it's potentially stigmatizing. And many autistic people say that they would prefer to just call it autism. But your other point about this new framework of neurodiversity, I think is really important, because although it's not new, the idea has been around since the late 90s. It's becoming more and more sort of available in our discourse, in our conversation. And I think it's really because we're recognizing that there isn't a single way for the brain to develop. In fact, there are hundreds or maybe thousands of ways that the brain can develop differently in different people. And it would be wrong to say one kind of brain is normal and the other kinds of brains are all in some way pathological. Rather, we're just recognizing that diversity is the norm, that we all have different profiles of strengths and challenges, and we should respect differences and make space for these differences, whether we're talking about in education or in the workplace or in wider society. That and many disabilities might fall under this idea of neurodiversity. So autism is one, dyslexia might be another, ADHD is a third one, etc. But it's wrong just to focus on the disability part, because in certain environments, people with these diagnoses actually flourish.
Right. And talking about autism, what are the earliest signs of it? And how early in development can we detect signs of autism?
Yeah. So we published some research way back in 1996. It was a big population study. So it's a long time ago, showing you could diagnose autism as early as 18 months old. So in toddlers, particularly by looking at children who were not yet communicating non-verbally, and also especially using the pointing gesture. So a young child, even before they have words, is pointing at things and looking at things and checking if the other person is looking at the same point in space. And this is called joint attention or shared attention. And some children, even by that age, are not doing that, or they're doing it to a reduced level. And that seems to be one sign that predicts autism diagnosis. There are a bunch of other things too, that when it comes to pretense, young children, typically developing young children often like to pretend. And when they do this in play, it can be an indicator that they are entering the mind of the other person, that they're pretending that they're on the moon, or they're pretending that the doll that they're feeding is alive. So they're imagining the minds of other people or characters. And autistic children at that age, at 18 months old, their play is often much more logical and focused on the world of patterns. In fact, this was the topic of my recent book. It's called The Pattern Seekers, that these are kids or adults who have a very strong interest in patterns and rules and how things work. Systems is what I call it. So these differences emerge quite early, but it doesn't mean that we are very good at diagnosing autism as early as childhood, because many kids either get missed or they may be hiding their differences due to stigma. And so scientists and clinicians these days are talking about camouflaging or masking or pretending to be the same as every other child in the class when in fact the child is struggling with anxiety, particularly social anxiety, under the surface. And it may be that they don't get their diagnosis until they're teenage or even at the point of transition to adulthood, when they, the societal pressures increase.
Mm-hmm. Do autistic people generally have a lower quality of life? And if so, why is that? Is it because of some sort of disability, like the subset of autistic people who have lower cognitive ability, for example? Or is it mostly due to stigma, discrimination, and other societal issues?
Yeah, I think it's mostly the latter. So, we've done research looking at the mental health of autistic adults, and it's not a very good picture. We find the majority of autistic adults have depression, anxiety, I mentioned. 2/3 of them have felt suicidal, and 1/3 of autistic adults have even attempted suicide, planned or attempted suicide. So this is much higher than you'd expect in any other group in the population. And to my mind, this reflects that society is not supporting them in the best way. Autism, we mentioned, is a difference, but it's also a disability. And disabilities, under most countries' legislation, should deserve reasonable adjustments or accommodations in school or at work or in leisure, in order to sort of support the person, to make sure that they do have a good quality of life. One shocking statistic is that 85% of autistic adults are unemployed. So even though they can work and they have good cognitive abilities, there must be barriers in place to getting into work. And this is probably, as you say, about discrimination, even if it's not conscious.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that society could take some steps into accommodating more or better autistic people?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if we think back historically, many workplaces were entirely white, mm-hmm. and they were entirely male. So we knew that there was conscious or unconscious systematic exclusion of people who were not white or who were female or, other groups in society. And I think society has made efforts to counter this kind of discrimination, in the recruitment processes, in the selection processes, and also in the workplace itself. So even if somebody gets a job, being conscious of all kinds of bias that might exist. But I don't think we've done this sufficiently when it comes to disability. And certainly we haven't done it sufficiently when it comes to autism as a specific disability. Let's take an example, that if you apply for a job, they usually judge your application on your ability to communicate on paper when you write your application. And if you're lucky enough to get invited for an interview, usually they're looking at your ability to communicate to the panel, mm-hmm. To make eye contact, to read between the lines, your potential to fit into the team. Many of these things are precisely the areas that autistic people struggle with. So it's almost like saying, if you have a disability in any of these areas, you're not going to get chosen for the job. And that is discrimination.
Mm-hmm. So you've already touched a little bit on this earlier, but could you tell us more about what you call the systemizing mechanism? What is
Yeah.
it really about as a cognitive ability, I think?
Yeah. So in my book, The Pattern Seekers, I suggest that about 70,000 years ago, 70 to 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, modern humans, evolved a new circuit in the brain called the systemizing mechanism, which allows humans and no other species to look for special patterns in the world that I call if and then patterns. And this ability to look for these special patterns, if and then, underlies human invention, that we are the only species that can invent in a generative way. We don't just invent once, like many species do, with simple tools, but we invent all the time, kind of unstoppably. And we do this by analyzing the world in terms of if and then. So if I take something and I perform an operation on it, I do something to it, then I see what happens. So we are a species that likes to experiment or play with these variables. And when we do this, we sometimes improve on the design of a particular invention. And sometimes we come up with something entirely new. And I'm not just talking about physical tools, which is one kind of system. We can think in the archaeological record of the first bow and arrow as a tool, which involves, if I take a stretchy fiber and I attach an arrow and release the tension, then the arrow will fly, if and then. But also, so that was like 75,000 years ago. But we also see in the archaeological record the earliest musical instrument, which was a flute made from a hollow bone, and where we can imagine our ancestor saying or thinking, if I blow down the hollow bone and cover one hole, then it makes a particular sound. But if I blow down the hollow bone and cover two holes, it makes a different sound. So this was the invention not only of a tool to make sounds, but an invention of a system we call music, with lots of rules that govern that system of intervals and notes and keys and so forth. And we can think of lots of examples of this kind of invention, like the invention of mathematics, or the invention or the understanding of systems in the world around us.
And in this case, do you argue then that throughout our evolutionary history, this systemizing mechanism has been the target of sexual selection?
So this is where we're getting into territory which is politically sensitive. Mm-hmm. So we need to go through the evidence quite carefully.
Okay.
So we did a big online study, 600,000 people filled out a questionnaire called the Systemizing Quotient, which measures how interested you are in systems of different kinds, these if and then systems. And what we found was there is a small gender difference, that males on average score higher on the systemizing quotient compared to females. I have to underline these two words, on average, because of course it doesn't apply to all males or all females. But as a group, you see a statistically significant difference. We also found, we asked the same people to fill in a questionnaire about how many autistic traits they have. So this goes back to your first question about, is autism something that runs right through the population as a spectrum of individual differences? And it turns out we all have autistic traits. Like systemizing, autistic traits also falls on a bell curve. Most of us have an average number of autistic traits. Some people have an above average number. What we found was that the people who score high on systemizing also have more autistic traits. So we were finding a clue in the data, and this is true of males on average compared to females, that the more you systemize, the more autistic traits you have. So there's a kind of connection at the psychological level or the cognitive level between understanding systems and autistic traits. And then we've taken this evidence a little bit further to look at people who work in STEM, science, technology, engineering, or mathematics, compared to people who do not work in STEM, where STEM workers need good analytic or systemizing skills. And we found that people who work in STEM, again, have a higher autism spectrum quotient score, so more autistic traits. So we're getting lots of little clues that there's a link between aptitude in understanding systems and the number of autistic traits you have. And I should say that just because you have a lot of autistic traits doesn't mean you need a diagnosis. This is very much about this neurodiversity point, that some people have more autistic traits, that this kind of confers an advantage in certain fields where there are patterns that can be discovered. The social world is not one of those fields, it turns out, but the world of physics or music or mechanics, you know, these are fields where you can find patterns and make progress.
And when it comes to the distinction you establish between systemizing and empathizing, how should we think about that distinction? Because, I mean, is it the case that if someone is very high on systemizing, then she is necessarily very low on empathizing? I mean, is there some sort of conflict there between the two systems or not necessarily?
Yeah. So let's avoid the pronouns, because
yes,
because we can talk about individuals who may have a higher score on systemizing than they do on empathy. There's another measure we have called the empathy quotient, but you could imagine the opposite profile, someone who has a higher score on empathy than they do on systemizing. So in this big study, we classified people into 5 different profiles: people who lean more towards systems or more towards empathy, people who are equally good at both, and then people who are at the extremes, people who systemize nonstop but may struggle with empathy, or people who empathize nonstop but may struggle with systems thinking. Your question was, is there some kind of relationship or trade-off? The better you are at one, the worse you are at the other. And there does seem to be this kind of trade-off. There's a small but significant negative correlation when we look at the big data, which we're interested to understand better. What's driving this in the brain and ultimately in our biology. We don't think these things like, these psychological processes, systemizing or empathy, are only biological, but they may have a partly biological basis. Naturally, learning, postnatal experiences, culture plays a big role. But we see these differences across different cultures, which is quite interesting. For example, we just published a paper this year looking at performance on empathy, where you have to look at photographs of people's faces, just the eyes in the face, to judge what someone is thinking or feeling. So that's a test of empathy. And we found in the majority of countries, we looked at 57 different countries, females on average score higher than males. So could be a complex mix of social and biological factors contributing to that. And research needs to go into this more deeply.
Mm-hmm. Getting into what might be some of the biological bases to these differences? And I know this is sensitive territory, so we'll try to walk through it with that in mind. But what is the role that testosterone might play here?
Yeah. So about 20 years ago, we started quite a unique study where we were able to measure testosterone, which is a hormone that both sexes produce and are exposed to during pregnancy, and which is known to influence brain development. We were able to measure the hormone and then follow up the babies after they were born to see if there was any relationship between your level of prenatal testosterone and whether you score better on empathy or better on systems thinking, and also how many autistic traits you have. And we found significant correlations. All we have is correlations. It's just kind of an observational study. But the higher your prenatal testosterone, the more you struggle with empathy later in life, but the better your attention to detail and interest in systems, and the higher the number of autistic traits you have in childhood. So we've gone on to test this in some clinical samples where we've been collaborating with colleagues in Denmark, where they have a large collection in a biobank of amniotic fluid. This is the fluid around the fetus during pregnancy, where we could measure not just testosterone, but also estrogen, because both of these hormones change brain development. It's kind of well established in animal research. But what we found was that in pregnancies that later result in an autistic person, there were higher levels of both prenatal testosterone and prenatal estrogen. So we're kind of interested in this because autism is partly genetic. It runs in families. So where you have one autistic child in the family, you're more likely to have another one compared to the general population. And what we're interested to study at the moment is the interaction between the genetic predisposition and hormonal exposure. Because the causes of autism and the causes of this diversity in different brain types is quite complex.
So what you're saying is that there might be an interplay between genetic predisposition and exposure to testosterone in this case.
Testosterone and estrogen, both of these hormones are transcription factors. That means they can change the gene expression by binding to the DNA itself. So it's an example of what is sometimes called epigenetics, where you have an independent factor in the environment, in this case, the uterine environment, which can affect the genetics of the developing baby to change the pattern of development. So, you know, in the old days, we used to think about nature versus nurture. You know, nowadays we're thinking about a complex interplay, to use your word, between, you know, DNA and the surrounding environment, which can sometimes be the hormonal environment.
By the way, for the audience to get a better understanding of how these things are studied, how early are you able to measure testosterone prenatally? How do you do it? And I mean, is there a particular point in intra-uterine development where measuring testosterone already has some sort of significance in terms of brain development, for example?
Yeah. No, this is really important. And it's quite challenging because obviously, as scientists, we want to do research in an ethical way. So whereas with animal research, some scientists are willing to experimentally manipulate hormone levels, for example, and see what happens. In a way, they're using the laboratory animal as a system, and they're changing different variables, you know, if and then. If I add extra testosterone, let's see what happens. But obviously, in the case of humans, this would be entirely unethical. So the way we've done this is to ask women who are having a procedure called amniocentesis, which is performed in many countries as part of clinical practice, that if women are having this procedure where some of the fluid around the baby is extracted, often for genetic analysis, if they would also consent for us to analyze the level of hormones. And this is, I guess it's like the only ethical way that we've been able to study hormone exposure at the critical period. So you mentioned, prenatally. So this procedure, amniocentesis, tends to happen between about 12 and 20 weeks of gestation, of pregnancy. And this turns out to be the window in development where the hormones have an effect on the developing brain. Sometimes it's called the masculinization window because these hormones masculinize the body and the brain. And of course, it means it masculinizes processes to do with cognition.
Mm-hmm. So when looking at the brain development in fetuses and infants who are at low or high likelihood of developing autism, do we find differences there? Are there brain regions, brain structures that are different between people who will develop autism and the ones who won't?
Yeah. I mean, this is a really contemporary question because research right now is following such babies. Previously the research into the brain in autistic people was limited to people who already have a diagnosis, maybe adults or, older kids who have received a diagnosis, and then you can compare autistic people's brains to non-autistic people's brains. But if the key to autism is all happening very early in development, in a way, what you want to do is use technology like MRI at the earliest point. And these days, it's now possible to use MRI during pregnancy to look at the fetal brain, or in the first few weeks of life to look at the newborn baby's brain. And so studies are ongoing at the moment, following the pregnancies, the babies who have an older sibling who is autistic, because that new baby is at increased genetic likelihood for also becoming autistic. And it gives us an opportunity to try to examine differences. And this is the key point about diversity, differences that might be emerging very, very early in such infants. So we can't answer the question yet, but the research is happening in many centers around the world.
Mm-hmm. Since we talked a little bit about the biological factors, I think it would be fair also to ask you about what we know when it comes to the environmental factors. So are there any identified environmental factors that might contribute to the development of autism?
So the environmental factors must exist. And I say that because you can have genetically identical twins where one is autistic and one is not autistic. So if autism was purely genetic, if one is autistic, the other one should also be. So the fact that you can find twins they're called discordant, they differ, means there must be some non-genetic factors that also contribute to autism. But identifying these is a challenge. We've found one important factor, which is that if the mother has a medical condition called polycystic ovary syndrome, where she is producing high levels of testosterone, and she herself has symptoms like irregular menstrual cycle and late onset of puberty, and some other traits or characteristics, such women have an elevated likelihood of their child being autistic. So this is an example, if you like, of a hormonal factor. Other groups have found that women who have gestational diabetes, so diabetes during pregnancy, are more likely to have autistic children. And they think this may be because if you gain weight too quickly during pregnancy, that not only changes your insulin levels, which is a metabolic hormone, but also your sex steroid hormones like testosterone and estrogen. So again, a hormonal factor linked to the mother's weight during pregnancy. So, and the other sort of environmental factor, kind of environmental, is paternal and maternal age. That older mothers and fathers seem to be more likely to have an autistic child. And again, the reasons for this are still being explored.
About empathy, in the literature, many psychologists distinguish between cognitive and emotional empathy. Do you do the same in your work? And if so, would it be the case that some autistic people could have, for example, more or less cognitive empathy, but no emotional empathy, for example, or vice versa? How does it work exactly?
Yeah. So I think it's an important distinction. I'm glad you've mentioned it, because what we've mostly found is that autistic people struggle with cognitive empathy. So that's the ability to recognize what someone is thinking or feeling, maybe from their facial expression or their tone of voice or their body language or their context. But they don't struggle with affective empathy. So affective empathy is where you have an appropriate emotional response to somebody else's state of mind. So if an autistic person is told that somebody is in pain or in distress, it upsets them. They feel they want to go and help. So it's a kind of an intact emotional response to somebody else's state of mind. And the reason why I say this is important is it means that some aspects of empathy are not affected by autism. And it means that autistic people don't lack empathy globally. They may have a very specific disability in cognitive empathy. And in a way, this makes them almost the opposite of psychopaths, because psychopaths have the reverse profile. They may have very good cognitive empathy. They can read other people. That's how they're able to manipulate or deceive other people. But they don't have the emotional response to, for example, somebody else's distress, which is how they're able to hurt other people. So what we see clinically, I think, is that autistic people don't usually hurt others. They often find that they're confused by the social world and maybe avoid complex social situations like going to a party where you have to jump from one conversation to another and keep track of who said what and what they might be thinking. In real time, the social processing involves a lot of effort, and it can be mentally exhausting for autistic people to be in that situation. They may prefer one-to-one conversations where the social dynamics are kind of easier to track, and you can keep track of what's been said in the conversation and therefore infer what someone might be thinking or feeling. Or they may prefer the kind of non-social world of music or mathematics or fixing their bicycle, where all of the variables in the system are they're right in front of you. And you can see them just by observation or doing your experiments.
Mhm. Are there any scientifically supported interventions to enhance emotion recognition in autistic children and adults?
Yeah. So in kind of medical research, the best kind of evidence is called the randomized control trial. And these are very expensive to conduct, so we haven't had enough randomized control trials for autistic kids or people. But we conducted one trial where autistic children were either invited to be part of Lego therapy or Lego clubs, which is, using an interest that many autistic kids have, which is to play with Lego, to make systems, either patterns or constructions, or following a manual to build something. But instead of doing it alone, they could do it in small groups so that they were also getting the opportunity to socialize during an activity that they feel confident in, so that they could also get confidence in communication and turn taking and understanding social dynamics. And we found that if we compared autistic children who had the opportunity to go to Lego clubs after school compared to autistic children who didn't, those autistic kids who did have the intervention improved in their communication and in their social skills. So that's just one example. There are probably many interventions that you could do this with, but kind of demonstrating it, testing it, takes time, takes a research team, and takes funding.
Mm-hmm. So for this last part of the interview, I would like to get into sex differences. We've already touched on some of that a little bit.
Yeah.
But are there regions of the brain which are sexually dimorphic?
So I think that the field has been a bit limited by small scale studies. And for me, I think one new opportunity to look at what you're calling sexually dimorphic brain regions will come from a new resource called the UK Biobank. So this is a study that's funded by both the government and charities like the Wellcome Trust. And what they're doing is they're inviting thousands of people in the population to have brain scans, MRI scans. I think at the moment they have achieved 30,000 brain scans. And I think the goal is even more. I think 100,000 is the goal. And when they released the first 5,000 brain scans, there were differences between males and females on average. Most of them were more to do with the total volume of the brain, or the total volume of gray matter or white matter in the brain, which was larger in males than females on average. And again, very important to underline on average, because individuals may be typical or atypical for their sex. But there were hints also that there may be differences in specific structures in the brain, like the amygdala, for example, which is a limbic system part of the brain, which is involved in the experience of emotion and also recognizing emotions in others. But I think we need to wait. We need to sort of look at multiple data sets. We need to control for all the relevant variables like age and education and height and weight and a whole bunch of other things. And also the UK Biobank, impressive as it is only looking at adults over the age of 40. So ideally, we'd be looking at other data sets where you can look with an impressive number of brains but at earlier points in development. So I have a colleague here in Cambridge who is putting together as many publicly available data sets of MRI scans as possible. He's called Richard Bethlehem, and he published a paper in Nature just last year, showing the collection of now 200,000 brains as MRI data, but where you can look at change across age. And I think the plan is to analyze that in terms of gender. It's a kind of obvious thing to look at. But, you know, it's only in very recent years that we've had the opportunity to access publicly available data, because sometimes these differences are subtle and only emerge when you have big data.
Mm-hmm. The fact that you mentioned that most of these scans are done in adults, I think is very important, because one of the criticisms that people who are or position themselves against the biological basis of sex or gender differences is that when you look at scans, usually most of them are done on adults. And so if we were to really determine that those differences we find on those scans are biological and not the result of socialization, culture, or whatever kind of environmental factors or social factors, we should do them in infants, children, etc.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree with these critics. You know, I think we shouldn't assume something is biological when there may be a non-biological or environmental explanation that's available. So we know that society, parents, the media, schools, the toy industry, you know, they target boys and girls very differently. And so there may be all kinds of social or cultural factors that are pushing the genders to diverge very subtly, even in the early years. You know, even an example might be how much language is the child exposed to. You know, how much social interaction is the child exposed to, and what's the nature of the social interaction? So I think even if you find a gender or sex difference in the brain, if it's later in development, it could just reflect these postnatal differences in socialization. And the strong test in terms of biology will be if you find any of these differences either prenatally or very early in development, before there's been much opportunity for culture to shape the brain.
Mm-hmm. So do you think with the information we have that people who claim that we can really distinguish through brain scans, for example, or whatever other kind of way, between male and female brains, that claim is correct at this point in time or not?
So I've seen some studies which are trying to use machine learning to take hundreds or thousands of brains and train the computer to derive an algorithm to find the features that are sort of more associated with males and the features in the brain that are more associated with females. And then again, using machine learning to see how accurate can the computer take this neuroscience data to classify if this particular person is male or female. And I think the studies are kind of, there's some suggestion that it can be done, but the accuracy levels are never 100%. You know, the accuracy levels may be 90% or 92 or 93%, which is kind of impressive, but it does mean that you can't, in 100% of cases, distinguish between a male and a female brain. And that's exactly what you'd expect, really, because, I think if we look at the psychological data, all we really find is differences on average. There's nothing that's universal to males or to females. And actually, in most of our research, we find that the gender of the person is not really a very relevant factor. We're kind of more interested in, or what we find is more discriminating, is their cognitive style, whether they're more interested in people or in things, more interested in the world of patterns and systems, or the world of emotions and mental states. And that's kind of irrespective of their gender.
Mm-hmm. So you at least agree with some of the criticisms that people who come more from the camp of socialization, culture, and so on present when they talk about how some of these studies might be misinterpreted, or people might take advantage of them. Of course, I'm not accusing the scientists who do these studies of doing this, but some political figures, etc., might take advantage of some of this information to push for negative and discriminatory agendas. Right.
Yeah. No, I mean, I fully support those criticisms. I think the science can't tell you anything about how individuals perform. The science tells you about group averages, males and females, or different kinds of groups. And we know historically there has been discrimination against women. So it would be terrible if politicians or policymakers were using the science to say, this is why we should recruit, I don't know, more men into certain fields than women. This would be an injustice, and it would be repeating the mistakes of sexism in the past. What we've learned is that if you have an applicant sitting in front of you for a job, the fact that he or she looks male or female doesn't tell you anything about the kind of mind or brain that they have, and that you have to take each individual just as that, as an individual, and assess them for their particular style of processing information, their particular strengths and challenges. Otherwise, you are, falling into the trap of discrimination and sexism. Mm-hmm. Hopefully, we've moved away from that.
Mm-hmm. And also, and this will probably be my last question, the fact that across the interview you mentioned that these differences are average differences. I think that it is very important to stress that, because many people out there are atypical for their sex or gender. We have traits that are perhaps a little bit more masculine, others that are a little bit more feminine, if you want to classify things that way. Yeah. But there's lots of variation, and it's not that there are two discrete groups where people can fall and there's no overlap at all.
Yeah. No, I think only in the world of like science fiction, where they say men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or whatever. But this isn't actual science. And even in our studies where we did those big population studies looking at empathy and systemizing, we found that about 40% of men have a brain type that is more towards systems than empathy. And about 40% of women have the opposite profile, a brain that's focused more on empathy, on people than on systems. But that's only, and we found that was in each gender, that was actually twice as much as the other gender. So 40% of men would be type S compared to only 20% of women. But 40% of women would be type E for empathy compared to 20% of men. But you can see that although statistically you see these group differences emerging, it means that a lot of people are not showing the majority profile. They're atypical for their gender, as you say.
Yes. So, Dr. Baron-Cohen, just before we go, would you like to mention where people can find you or your work on the internet and make reference to any centers or other places where you work at?
No, thank you. So I'm at Cambridge University. I'm at the Autism Research Centre. So we have a website, which is autismresearchcentre.com. Primarily, I'm a scientist, and we try to make all of our publications available freely to download. And also all the tests that we use, we share with other scientists for free. I mentioned that I wrote a book recently called The Pattern Seekers, which is published in the US by Basic Books, but also in the UK by Penguin Random House. And it's a kind of, for me, it's a book which is exploring all the topics we've talked about, but it's kind of a celebration of autistic people, precisely for the reasons that we can see the contribution that they've made to human progress, and yet we're leaving them outside of society. So we need, it's a kind of a call to action to make sure that we finally recognize the important contributions that autistic people have and can continue to make. They have made and can continue to make in our world.
Great. So I will be leaving some links to your work and particularly to your books and The Pattern Seekers specifically, which I read and is a fantastic read. I recommend it to everyone, to my listeners and viewers. And Dr. Baron-Cohen, I wouldn't like to end the interview before saying that I've been a big fan of your work for many years now, and I am really honored that you accepted the invitation for this interview. So thank you so much for your time, and it was great to talk to you.
Well, your questions were great, and I enjoyed our conversation. So a big thank you to you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting it on Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description box of this interview. And if you like this interview, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litzka, Blanchett Perga, Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Herbert Gintis, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Henry Kalenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Jorge Spinha, Michael Stormer, Samuel Andrea, Francis Fort, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Harl Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Antonio Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pablo Stazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, Saim Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morton Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, João Barbosa, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringman, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, and Igor N., And special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffinia, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hughney, Curtis Dixon, Belnick Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis and Alnick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.